Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Time.
Oh my God, I'm so ready.
Alternative path.
I am ready. Dan Snow and Simon from the In-Betweeners. One of you guys recommended me this video in the comments probably like 2 weeks ago on a video I watched about the Battle of Britain. And I spent a good amount of that reaction talking about this sort of hypothetical. And a lot of the times I hear, I'm going to talk a lot in the video. I don't need to do a big intro. Just a lot of the times I always hear like there is no way, no matter what individual scenario worked in Germany's favor, that, you know, in the end they would have lost. But if you take out Britain, USA isn't even in the war yet. You don't know if the US will join the war in Europe now. The only way to get into Europe is going to go through the south and over the Mediterranean, and a lot more fighting in North Africa, the Middle East. And you won't be able to get Russia as much of supplies as they did. That enabled them to resist Germany for as long as they did. There are just a lot of factors that enter into the equation when you take Britain out of the equation. Does that make sense?
Let's history might have taken. Welcome to Real Fake History, the show that goes back in time and imagines alternative paths that history might have taken. It's naughty, but you're going to love it.
Oh, I like it. Alternative history.
At any time, there are an infinite number of versions of the future. What would have happened if events had taken a different turn? I always think it's a reminder that what actually did happen was not inevitable at all. And our world, which we take for granted, could be so very different. 80 years ago, these planes were in the skies above Britain. Germany had advanced across Western Europe, and only Britain stood in her way. We all know how the story goes from there. How the brave few, the RAF pilots of Fighter Command, managed against all the odds to defeat the German Luftwaffe, leaving Britain to fight on. But things could have been very different. In early September 1940, the Germans launched an all-out assault on London, shifting their target away from RAF airfields. This was a mistake. It gave the RAF time to rebuild and regroup. But what if things had gone differently? Well, I've assembled a top team of historians and experts to come with me through the looking glass. Luke Pepperer, Joe Thomas and Victoria Taylor are each going to outline an alternative fake history scenario, explaining what could have happened had the RAF lost the Battle of Britain in 1940. Luke Pepperer, how are you doing?
Very good.
Ready for this?
Yes, I am, thank you. I think the Battle of Britain, obviously being such an important part of the British national story, British mythology, British memory, that victory, if it hadn't happened, and what Britain would have looked like, would be exciting to explore.
Joe Thomas, what about you? What do you make of the battle?
Well, I suppose I'm coming at this from a sort of actor's point of view, and I think it's interesting just how much of a part of kind of national mythology it is. It looms so large in our national consciousness, and I think it is interesting to look at history in different ways and say, well, if things had just gone slightly differently, what would have happened? And I think counterfactual history is really, really fascinating stuff.
Victoria Taylor, you spend most of your days in archives finding out what actually did happen. Are you nervous about thinking about what might have happened?
It's quite chilling to see those different plans and different ideas that could have come about, and also the fact that, you know, a victory is made up of thousands of failures as well, and it's just interesting to see which failures would have been particularly pivotal in changing the course of history.
Well, yeah, so now I'm wondering, are they just saying if the Battle of Britain was lost, are they going to explore how the UK might have fought back on Britain and maybe not have capitulated? Or because I kind of went into this thinking, you know, Britain is out of the war, then what happens with the rest of the war, you know? So
thank you all very much for joining me. Let's embark on this adventure and imagine what would have happened if Britain had lost the Battle of Britain.
It is the summer of 1940, and waves of Nazi bombers are crossing the Straits of Dover, whilst the pilots of the Royal Air Force attempt to intercept them. Fighting is fierce in the skies over southern England as the outnumbered RAF struggle to maintain air superiority and prevent German bombers targeting their air bases and critical infrastructure. On the 13th of August 1940, Reich Marshal Hermann Goering orders Adlertag, an all-out assault against the RAF bases defending southern England. Britain's secret weapon, radar, is destroyed by Stuka dive bombers, leaving the RAF blind to incoming Luftwaffe attacks. In a devastating blow, massed German bombers break through and knock out all of 11 Group's key airfields, destroying hundreds of RAF fighter planes on the ground.
Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Sorry, guys.
Low on
That was my other video. That was my other video got finished uploading there, and so it played. Sorry about that.
planes of RAF fighter planes on the ground. Running low on planes and pilots, the RAF is forced to pull back its exhausted frontline forces to protect England's industrial heartlands. By late summer, Britain has lost control of the skies.
So the RAF have been destroyed. Its airfields are smoking ruins. Joe Thomas, what happens next? What is the real fake history scenario that you're going to give us?
So Britain has lost the Battle of Britain. So that means that the Germans now have air superiority. So that means that Operation Sea Lion, which is the name for the invasion of Britain by Nazi Germany, can go ahead. So that's 60,000 plus troops, 3,000 paratroopers, over 4,000 horses as well, and also underwater tanks, underwater panzers, so submersible tanks that can go along the seabed of the English Channel. All of that is now going to invade Britain.
That's the scenario. Let's take a look at what our future...
Wouldn't, rather than even invade England, go ahead with Operation Sea Lion, or at least as a precursor to it, wouldn't you use your air superiority to just decimate any hope of, any English naval power around the English Channel and in the North Sea and whatnot? And would you then go and just threaten to just, annihilate everything unless you surrender? And, your a lot of your historical buildings and just your population will be bombed, and so to essentially surrender, right? Could you force them to surrender before an invasion, or just annihilate their naval power with your fighters and bombers?
Alternative universe history presenter might have made of it.
September 1940, and the RAF has been defeated by the German Luftwaffe, giving Germany control of the skies. Across England, ports and airfields lie in ruin, following a bombing campaign that leaves Britain vulnerable to invasion. Germany launches its attack by sea and hits the beaches that lie in ruin, following a bombing campaign that leaves Britain vulnerable to invasion. Germany launches its attack by sea and hits the beaches of southern England, the largest invasion of its kind since 1066. But, though Britain's air force is in ruin, the might of the Royal Navy and her coastal defences is more than a match for the Nazi war machine. Hitler's forces are hounded in the Channel and repelled from their landing grounds on British beaches. By autumn 1940, the German juggernaut is halted and the Wehrmacht defeated. But the question is, will Britain fight on?
So, Joe,
how does it, just thinking about the Pacific War and how important aircraft carriers were in fighting the Japanese, because you can essentially launch attacks from very far away to where your target can't even see you yet, and just attack them with planes. Would the British Navy still be able to succeed in protecting Britain, even though it has no air power? Its air power is destroyed, and I feel like repeated attacks by German aircraft could bring the British Navy to its knees, maybe.
So, Joe, there we have it. The Royal Navy, the biggest navy on Earth. They halt the invasion. Tell us, how did it happen?
Well, the Royal Navy was 10 times the size of the German Navy, and Hitler did have a plan, I think called Z Plan, which was to try and achieve naval parity with Britain. But that was only ever going to happen by about 1944 to 46, and that was Hitler's own, presumably quite optimistic estimate. So the Royal Navy becomes the thing that saves Britain.
Yeah, well, the British were quite prepared for an invasion. I mean, that was what they thought was going to happen. So there's barbed wire put on the beaches, there's the home guard is readied, people are told what they should do in the course of an invasion. Churchill is even prepared to use quite wicked and dastardly weapons on the Germans, things like mustard gas.
And that's if the Germans even managed to get to the beaches. But Victoria, you think the Navy would have just intercepted them? They wouldn't even got within swimming distance of the White.
They're the experts, okay? These guys. But you don't have air power. Why would the Germans even need to do anything but just they keep air superiority and just keep sending bombing raids until
Close to Dover. What about the Luftwaffe? They've got control of the skies. Why wouldn't they have just cleared the way for the fleet to come across the channel?
It's possible that the Luftwaffe could have made it a little bit more difficult for the Royal Navy, although it lacked that real sort of naval aviation element. You know, Goering had really sort of hoarded all these resources from the Kriegsmarine, from the German Navy for the Luftwaffe, but had ignored that section. So the Luftwaffe would have had to make sure that it had the right tools to attack the Royal Navy.
It's not the easiest thing in the world just to drop a bomb on a ship that's going along at 26 knots. 10,000 feet below.
Yeah, I think the Germans definitely did overestimate perhaps the power of the Luftwaffe. I mean, even crossing the channel by the time they were near or over Britain, most of their planes were running out of fuel. And the Navy anyway, and the real history being the unsung heroes of the Battle of Britain, making those daring raids and destroying the barges and all that kind of stuff, a real important part of the British war machine.
Joe, Lucas.
Wouldn't you just, as you get air superiority as the Germans, when you achieve it, just don't send anyone over there yet, but continue to wreak havoc in the Atlantic to make sure that any convoys going from America to Britain don't make it there. And the British will have to have their naval forces very much close to home in order to defend against any potential invasion. And so if I'm the Germans, don't be hasty. You have air superiority. Now just continue bombing naval dockyards, shipyards, other factories, everything. You know, keep doing it, and then have your submarines keep the U-boats doing their job in the Atlantic, and eventually you might not even have to sail across the English Channel.
Good point, right? Barges. I mean, the Germans aren't exactly coming in. They're massive warships. It's all a bit primitive, isn't it?
Well, that's it. I mean, I've been sort of poking around on various message boards about sort of with like military history nerds, and one guy said the Germans just thought of this as a big river crossing. They are literally converted civilian barges, and they were really, really slow.
Okay, so you guys are not super bullish about the German Navy getting those barges across, but imagine they do. There's a storm, weird stuff happens at sea, Joe. What happens if they do manage to hit the coast? Because their problems are arguably just beginning.
So pillboxes, maybe mustard gas. Also more outlandish things like literally creating fire in the sea, having these underwater tubes that would release petrol that would be set ablaze.
Yeah, there were rumours spreading, not only in Britain, but all around Europe, of the British essentially having these bombs which when dropped on the channel, dropped on the water, would release this flammable liquid, which would then be set on fire, and there'd just be this huge firewall around Britain as part of its protection. I mean, whether they actually had this technology and this ability, I think is debatable.
Let's say they do manage to get across the channel in these ridiculous slow barges. They do manage to break through the largest fleet in the world at that time. They get through the petrol on the water on fire. They get through the mustard gas. They fight their way onto the beach. What's waiting for them on the beach? Who's there?
The remnants of the British Expeditionary Force, who of course had been evacuated from Dunkirk. They would have also found the existing armies from Poland, from France, from occupied countries, from the Nazis. I mean, you know, the Polish already had 35,000 troops by the summer of 1940 in Britain, ready to get into the thick of it once more. But there would have certainly been regular troops there ready to take them on.
Now, everyone likes to take the piss out of Dad's army, the Home Guard, but there are a lot of them, some of them World War I veterans. There were a lot of people that were ready to withstand that invasion.
Absolutely. Men who were aged between 17 and 65, you know, so not quite the age in certain cases to actually have been called up, but also at an age where they could be useful.
Early 40s, prime of life, Victor, I think you'll find. No problem there. And Joe, some of their equipment was a little bit homemade, but still works. You want to be on the receiving end of it.
No, they're seriously lethal weapons in the right hands. So speaking of the right hands, this is a little thing I've made. This is a self-igniting phosphorus grenade, and these were produced in huge numbers. 6 million of these were made. This is a half-pipe milk bottle. At the bottom there's phosphorus. At the top there's benzene, in the middle there's water, and there's also a rubber tube which would dissolve into the mixture and make it more sticky. The idea is that when you threw this, it would self-ignite, and then you get a kind of sticky, explosive, burning sort of mass of stuff. So it's an amateur weapon, but actually, you know, in the hands of a force that numbers like 1.5 million.
Well, the propaganda was that these would be used probably against German tanks. So you have German tanks rolling up the coast, and then you have the Home Guard throwing these against these tanks and trying to take them out in any way they could.
You know what? In the ruins of Stalingrad, a lot of this German armour were taken out by things not much more sophisticated than that. So it's not impossible. But Joe, the ones that I can't get over their bravery would have been the ones that sort of volunteered to stay behind as the auxiliary units.
Yeah, an incredible thing to volunteer for. So what these people would do was they would, as the German line was advancing into Britain, they would remain behind enemy lines and basically hide. It really was quite sort of James Bond-like in a way, or maybe James Bond, well, Basil Brush maybe, but they would literally hide in like abandoned badger sets. I mean, it was really like that level of sort of guerrilla warfare.
They were prioritised as well. You know, you sort of had that equipment that they were exposed to that sometimes even the regular forces weren't exposed to. So, you know, having high caliber sniper rifles that could, you know, assassinate someone from, you know, like a mile and a half away, you know. So they really had that emphasis, and they also had that diversity of, well, having both men and women involved.
I mean, I think it's suicidal bravery, surely lifespan measured in days, the kind of thing you expect to see more in the Japanese resistance to the Americans in Iwo Jima, Okinawa towards the end of the war, might have happened in Kent.
All right, I'm not dogging the British, okay? You guys are incredibly brave in World War II, okay? But there's a difference between brave and psychotic, which is what the Japanese seem to be. Fanatically psychotic, as in you would rather jump off a cliff with your child than be captured, or you do a bonsai charge. And I'm not saying there wouldn't be like I hesitate to say this, but I know I'm coming from a place that is not disrespecting the British. I just, if the Americans can island hop with the most savage, unbelievably maniacal people in World War II, the Japanese soldiers, and island hop, and then eventually go to Japan, where they do have nuclear weapons, but this is before nuclear weapons, the island hopping, then you don't think the German war machine could take one single large island, which with a determined and resilient and brave enemy, but not maybe to the extreme where it's insanity that the Japanese maybe had. So, of course, they would give a lot of fight. But I guess I'm sticking on, like, would the Germans need to do this before already kind of annihilating an enormous part? I'm trying to say something that is, in my mind, logical, but I don't want to make it sound disrespectful, as if like the British wouldn't fight to the last man, woman, or child. But at some point, wouldn't, if the Americans can do that to the Japanese, wouldn't the German war machine, before other fronts took its attention, could do the same to Britain?
1940, extraordinary. Yeah. Okay, well, you've laid out a pretty terrifying, unlikely path to victory here. Do you think, Joe, Hitler would have risked it? I'm
inclined to think not. I think if you look at the way the Nazis liked to wage war, it was always really, really quick. It was like, right, and we're going, and it's surprise and it's speed. And where, if you look at what was happening in sort of even like May to September of 1940, there was a lot of kind of going back and forth, and like the army wanted a broad front to attack, but the navy said, well, we need to have a narrow front, and just the whole kind of timbre of the way they were talking about it suggests that really they just don't think it's
They don't think it's viable.
They don't think it's viable. Yeah.
Would I feel like maybe Britain would turn into what Spain and the Iberian Peninsula was to Napoleon, in being subdued and not so much a giant threat, but still a pain in the arse and resilient kind of guerrilla force, and that maybe is much more difficult to stamp out than you can do with traditional war tactics, you know? So, but my main sticking thing is would they have needed to even do this? Couldn't they have just kept on mainland Europe and with air supremacy just bomb targets without opposition?
Yeah, but, you know, Hitler was a gambler, and you stand there in northern France outside Calais and you can see the White Cliffs. It seems so close. Napoleon stood there and said, let us be master of the Channel for just 6 hours and we should be masters of the world. Hitler must have thought the same thing.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned like the time period there, because actually it's probably not necessary to assume that the Germans needed to seize control of the whole of the English Channel. Some plans involve creating, in effect, a corridor across the Channel with mines on one side, mines on another, defended as best they could by whatever forces they had, and just keeping that corridor open for long enough to get those troops across. So I think if it was going to happen at all, possibly it was that narrow corridor of opportunity just for maybe 24, 48 hours. That's how it could have happened.
What about paratroopers as well?
So Joe Thomas has been telling us...
Probably couldn't get enough paratroopers over there to do any real damage by themselves.
...about a failed... So Joe Thomas has been telling us about a failed German invasion of Britain in the summer of 1940. For our next scenario, Victoria Taylor, what are you going to tell us?
This scenario is if Operation Sea Lion succeeds. So we've got the Luftwaffe in the skies, we've got the Navy patrolling around.
This is where I think it gets really interesting about the wider implications of World War II and how it ends.
On the coast, we've got the troops landing on the ground. So it's this period of looking at how the Germans would have consolidated their rule and control over Britain.
So Victoria, you're sketching out the unimaginable, Britain occupied by Nazi Germany. Let's take a look at what could have happened.
1940, and having lost the battle for the skies, Britain lies at the mercy of the German war machine. Though her army and navy fight with courage, the onslaught is unstoppable, and the German stranglehold over Europe now extends to Britain. In the months that follow...
Actually, wait, this is something that could be even more interesting.
British government...
What would happen to the king and queen? What would they go to Canada or... Okay, all right. What...
The onslaught is unstoppable, and the German stranglehold over Europe now extends to Britain. In the months that follow, the British government falls, cities are placed under military rule, and the royal family escape into hiding.
Into Canada?
But though Britain is occupied and overrun, there remains hope that she will come to resist her oppressor. And with the forces of the British Empire behind her, break free and be liberated from the shackles of Nazi rule.
I feel like the most likely scenario might be, if this succeeds, is for, I mean, if Britain falls even before Pearl Harbor, I feel like that might really make Americans, very isolationist Americans, realize, like, all right, it doesn't really matter if they're directly attacking us. They are changing the entire way the world works, and we need to do anything to stop them. And so I'd imagine once Operation Barbarossa starts, even if it's before Pearl Harbor, okay, in this timeline, I feel like all effort of the United States would probably be to aid the Soviet Union and try and I don't know if it's aid the Chinese, like in this timeline. I'm sure it would become very Pacific and Middle Eastern oriented and then finally an invasion into Europe through Italy over the Mediterranean, and by the Soviets, like happened in our timeline. But I'm sure that's what would happen, is all strength would go behind the Soviets if they were invaded.
Temporarily occupied and divided, will her people be able to reclaim their island?
Dramatic stuff, Victoria. How do the Germans go about imposing rule on one of their occupied territories, like Britain?
It's most likely that
did they
Germany
do
would
in
have
France?
imposed their rule on Britain rather in the same way that they had in France and in Poland. So there would have been an establishment of German
Vichy
time in Britain. There would have been a period of martial law. So anyone that could potentially oppose the German invaders would have been rounded
Philippe
up.
Pétain.
Joe, Victoria mentions this rounding up of prisoners. There was a list, and you'd want to be on that list.
You did want to be on the list because it was the Nazi blacklist, so if you weren't on it, it meant the Nazis thought you were kind of a good egg. Noel Coward's friend was pleased that they were both on the list and said, these are the people you do want to be seen dead with. But yeah, no, it was about 2,800 people, and it was prominent people within British society who represented, I guess, an ideological threat to the Nazis, or just had influence and were not Nazis.
Yes, a Nazi official, Schellenberg, I think, who compiles this list of people. I mean, he's also looking at the British institutions and kind of drawing up, what are they about? What's their character?
I think it's people who today you might call influencers. I think it's anyone who's a sort of locus of influence and maybe ideology that's different to the Nazis. Even something like the Boy Scouts, which seems a bit silly, would have been targeted as a potential source of...
So just anyone who has an inkling of capability to be self-sufficient and have any sort of helpful influence on a potential uprising or underground. It's what you would want to do. If you're going to occupy a place, make sure everyone that isn't under direct imprisonment or killed or control is not a threat and is just going to be a regular occupied citizen and won't put up too much trouble. Makes sense.
One very obvious source of resistance is one Winston Churchill. What do you think happens to him?
Winston Churchill
Canada.
really could have gone one of two ways. So there's the typical narrative of him potentially, sort of going down with a pistol in his hand and choking on his own blood and, absolutely shedding every last inch of blood, sweat and tears for Britain. But there's also the sort of different opportunities of retreating to his bunker and sort of seeing if he can continue the fight from there, or if it's a case of trying to flee to another country.
He did claim that the story of this Long Island would not come to an end until each one of us talking about his cabinet was on the ground choking on their own blood. So he was saying that he was going to stay and fight.
Well, typical bombastic sort of Churchillian.
It doesn't. Someone saying something to rile up. I'm not saying he wouldn't, but of course that's someone trying to ensure their citizens that we're in this, like we'll do this. But if going to Canada or somewhere where you can continue the war, and rather than go through like the heroic way, it could suit the future of Britain better if you say flee to Canada or something.
But we know that actually he was, in his character, a bit of a warmonger. He writes actually when he's a young soldier, fighting first in the Boer War and then obviously in World War I, he writes, I believe, to his mother, saying that he's excited to go to war not in spite of the dangers but because of them. So this is a character who throughout his life loves the war games and he loves being on the battlefield, and it's very possible that he could have gone down, as he boasted, in a blaze of glory. Either that or he's imprisoned and executed, which I think is also another possibility, because he's certainly, if he's not at the top of Schellenberg's Black Book, he's definitely in the top 5.
What about the royal family, Joe? What would they have stayed behind, do you reckon?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the royal family, because you've got the Duke of Windsor, who...
I keep saying Canada now, not as like a cowardice, but as like a smart decision, I think. And I think a lot of it would depend on what America is starting to feel. If it can be best served to go to Canada and work with the Americans for some plan to take down the Nazis, then that would be just a smart thing to do. I'm not saying like they'd go to Canada as if I think they're cowards or anything. I just think it's smart.
has often been sort of accused of basically rather liking going and toadying up to Hitler. So he's somebody who I think maybe the Nazis might have looked at as somebody to kind of bring into their orbit. I think the Nazis quite liked having sort of celebrity supporters.
Yeah, because he and Wallace Simpson actually make a trip to Germany in 1937, and they're inspecting.
Hitler would need to find his Philippe Pétain. Philippe Pétain. I never forget the name, because it's just such a fun name to say. Philippe Pétain, who was a World War I hero general from France, but who became the it's seemingly enthusiastic leader of Vichy France, that now conquered France. And you would need to find someone who would do the same in Britain and be seen with some sort of authority, some sort of Britishness, but on your side as the occupier, on the German side.
The German troops actually praising him as this sort of great rebuilder of Germany.
And of course the Germans wanted this sense of legitimacy as well, and even though, of course, there's the abdication crisis, he is the original king. Yeah. So, it is certainly an option that would have been considered by the National Socialists.
Somebody like the Duke of Windsor, I personally think they would have snapped up.
I actually don't know if it's a perfect fit, because it might have the opposite effect, just being like, you goddamn traitor. It might be better to have someone who wasn't as openly pro-Germany, or at least friendly to Germany, prior to the war, it seemed. So maybe that would have the opposite effect.
Throughout the history of that party, even like Goering himself, when he first joined, he joined early, and it was a big coup because he was basically a famous World War I fighter ace, and they made a big deal of that. And I think that's why Hitler liked to have Goering right at the top all the time, because he was like this kind of national hero. Hindenburg as well, President Hindenburg, when they were coming to power, the day of Potsdam, that was a big deal. Again, a senior old aristocrat who makes you look legitimate and like you're not going to do anything really stupid, and you're not really that grubby, and after all, maybe it won't be that bad. The Nazis love people like that. So I think that I'm not saying that that's the road that the Duke of Windsor would have gone down.
They would have wanted him.
They would have loved it. Yeah, they would have been up for it.
But Victoria, there was a plan to snatch the royal family and spirit them away across the Atlantic.
Yes, there was Operation Coates. So this was an operation of having 4 different fortified houses in order to take the royal family at a moment's notice. But of course, it was made particularly complicated because they had to decide who they were saving and how they were saving. So the Queen always said that the king would stay in Britain. But of course, that would have endangered the princesses, who are the heirs to the throne. So you've got this dilemma of trying to protect the king for, the nation's morale, but also you've got the issue of trying to protect the future of the monarchy as well.
There's a few
probably connected
second cousins, royal second cousins, trying to get on that plane as well, aren't there?
Yes, definitely.
So, Victoria, I think the Brits like to think of themselves as fighters, and Churchill's rhetoric sort of stirring up this national resistance campaign against German invaders. Do you think that's mythology?
I think it is mythology to a certain extent, but I think a lot of that has actually been superimposed. So my object is very recognisable. This is the Keep Calm and Carry On poster, which, many people sort of look at in terms of being absolutely, indicative of British stiff-upper-lipness and morale and keeping that sort of resolve, but it actually wasn't issued during the Second World War. So this was produced by the Ministry of Information in 1939, and it was sort of looking at bolstering British morale in the case of, sort of aerial bombardment and eventually a Nazi invasion. And over 2 million of these posters were produced, but because they were never used, they were pulped towards the end of the war and ended up only resurfacing in 2000.
It's almost like we're misremembering aspects of the 1940s. In fact, some of Churchill's most famous speeches, he spoke them in the House of Commons, but they were never broadcast to the nation.
There's a word for that. Something that you think like is reinforced so much that you think happened at a certain time, but really it never did. I forget the word.
There's actually a picture of him lying in bed recording them, but they weren't actually broadcast in his time. Like Dan says, he made them in Parliament. Some of it was spoken by newsmen, but people who were alive at the time swear that they heard it on the radio and that they were roused to protect their country, fight for their country.
Absolutely, and there's this sort of sense with Churchill that, he's this amazing sort of off-the-cuff speaker, and of course he is an amazing orator, but, a lot of it is pre-prepared, a lot of it's recorded after the time he's meant to have given the speech, so it is absolutely perfectly choreographed to be as impactful as possible.
Well, Victoria Taylor, thank you for outlining.
Let me use a different country, just country X or whatever, random country, right? So that I don't feel boxed in my response, because I don't want to like say something disrespectful or whatnot. Just country A is getting invaded, right? And the leaders, of course, you might feel legitimately that like we will die to the last person. We're here with you. But also, as a strategic way, even if you don't feel that way, you want to present that image. And so trying to determine in this alternative scenario whether or not the leaders who in our timeline did say these things would have followed through with them, who knows? Because it is both strategic and could be a genuine feeling, right? And when it comes to countries like Britain, like the US, right, or like other ones, compared to countries, I won't even include Germany here, okay, or Russia, countries like Japan, or there's a difference between love for your country and a sort of religious fanaticism, okay, because the religious fanaticism, it is not going to be affected about how the tides turn nearly as much as a more rational fanaticism, right? And so you never know. As things change, you're not like the Japanese who, even if, it is hopeless, it is you and 4 men versus 10,000 American soldiers going towards you. You're going to run out with grenades and samurai swords, right? It doesn't matter because it's a sort of religious adherence to Japan, to the emperor himself. And countries like the US, like France, like the UK, like Germany, like Russia, you don't have that. It doesn't mean, in Russia's case, you can't be extremely, and Germany in a sense, but Russia's case, extremely difficult to crush. What's the word? Resilient, right? As they were. But there's a difference between resilience and just pure willingness to die no matter what, right? And you have to realize that even as much as you love, if you're Britain, or I love Britain or stuff, in populations that don't have that factor, you might not be as adamant about protecting your country as you might be when it comes down to it, okay? And I mean, not when it comes down to it as if as soon as you see them, you're going to scared and run. I mean, if stuff turns out to be, it's a losing thing, you might capitulate, right? That's a factor that you don't want to admit, but
Lining the
you have to.
unimaginable. Britain falls under the Nazi yoke.
I'm not saying you would be like the French. I love the French, okay? I know French history. I admire French history, not just World War II, right? Amazing history in the past. But I'm not saying that Britain is going to fall in a similar manner and fashion and length of time as the French did. But I don't think they're going to hold out like the Japanese did. And so how much is up to us to think.
After a summer of brutal combat in the skies above Britain, the RAF has been defeated, but that wasn't necessarily the precursor to more violence, was it, Luke Pepperer?
No, although German air superiority has been established and the British airfields are little more than ashes, the British, instead of wanting to fight on, decide to negotiate a peace.
Let's take a look at how that might have happened.
In winter 1940, the situation looks perilous for Great Britain. All of Western Europe has fallen to the Blitzkrieg and the Royal Air Force is destroyed by relentless Luftwaffe attacks. German bombers pound London day and night, levelling great swathes of the city. With her skies defenceless and her people under siege in their own homes, the British government seeks terms for a cessation of hostilities.
Hold on a second.
German forces destroyed by relentless Luftwaffe attacks. German bombers pound London day and night, levelling great swathes of the city. With great swathes of the
Did another bomb just hit this building, or an explosion, and whoever's directing the cannon water kept directing it? Because that is, if that's the case, that is the most badass thing I've ever seen. I thought at first maybe it was just, you know, it was already burning in the beginning of this clip, but it looks like it engulfs.
city as pound London day and night, leveling great
That
waves of the city.
an explosion or another bomb just hit, and the guy kept spraying.
Pound London day and night, leveling great swathes of the city. With her skies
Who is that guy? And how does he walk around with freaking balls that big?
night, leveling great swathes of the city. With her skies defenseless and her people under siege in their own homes, the British government seeks terms for a cessation of hostilities with Herr Hitler. And a historic treaty ends the conflict between these two great nations. But will the peace last?
And the thing that is going to be, I think, a lot different compared to the what's, you know, Allo Allo, the show, about what the French resistance is going to be like, is that I think a lot of the French resistance relied on French leaders in a free Great Britain kind of coordinating stuff. But you don't have another landmass a little off the coast that isn't conquered by the Germans in the case to continue this. You'd have to go to Canada or US and then continue it across the Atlantic. And so I think it would be significantly more difficult for both French and British resistance efforts than what happened with France in our timeline, you know?
Luke, what kind of terms would Hitler have offered Britain?
Well, it really depends if he's thinking about what the Germans themselves had to suffer after the Treaty of Versailles, after the conclusion of the First World War. Of course, what really irked the Germans was not only the reparations they had to pay and also the loss of their economic power, but the war guilt clause. They had to take responsibility, economic, political, financial, and of course moral responsibility for the First World War.
But the Germans still have their main enemy ahead of them. This was at the end of a war in World War I. Here, it's not the end. You still got to worry about Russia that you want to invade. And so I'm sure they would maybe have to put all of the punishment that they might want to put on Britain because as payback for the Treaty of Versailles. The war is not over for Germany.
They actually felt betrayed by their European cousins, and life became very, very grim. So whether Hitler would have wanted to effect a kind of revenge on the British people, or because he loved Britain, would he actually have taken it easy on them?
Yes, he was a bit of a fan of Britain, wasn't he?
He was a
them as,
complete
like,
Anglophile,
Aryan.
even before he writes Mein Kampf, even before he has any kind of political power. He's talking about his admiration of Britain, and he's writing about his admiration of Britain. Not only are they formed of good Anglo-Saxon stock, which obviously fits into his Aryan narrative, but also the way in which the British have been able to bring under their control huge swathes of the globe in the form of the empire, from Africa to India to the Far East. Hitler greatly admires this, and don't forget he actually fought as well against the British in the First World War. So Hitler had seen firsthand the ability and the capacity not only of the British people, but also of the British war machine and of the British political establishment as well.
And he made a direct appeal, didn't he?
He made several direct appeals. It's interesting, even after war is officially declared by Chamberlain in 1939, and as late as July 1940, Hitler makes a speech in the Reichstag called A Last Appeal to Reason. Now, copies of this speech, or transcripts of this speech, are actually airdropped over Britain, and here comes one of them now, down into my hands, and it's just a transcript of the entire speech, and now it's really long and really dry and really boring. So the British public don't even take the time to read it. In fact, a second copy of the speech, an abridged version, is also dropped, and it is hoped that the British people will take to that abridged version. But again, they don't. Some of the British public are even using this speech as toilet paper.
He should have used Twitter, like any other self-respecting autocrat. Joe, but there are elements of the British establishment that are pretty pro-Hitler.
Yeah, I think there were people who were prepared to see Hitler as not necessarily
Overlord.
benign, but kind of almost an inevitable thing that was going to happen and not completely bad. Like, just it's quite good to have a strong Germany again. Also, throughout the 1930s, Hitler just lied through his teeth constantly, saying that all he ever wanted was peace. And I think there were people enough who were prepared to believe him. So there were influences within Britain who I think probably would have been prepared to countenance a peace with Hitler. Whereas I think Churchill was a bit of an outlier in that respect, and Churchill basically said, we might as well fight until the very end, because making peace is going to be no better than that. And I think that's kind of an argument that, like, most of us now would say is the right one. I think any sort of peace with Hitler just seems, in a way, completely revolting just because of who Hitler was.
I think if we're talking about peace, obviously one of our...
The Holocaust is not known about yet, is it? And so I feel like prior to the world knowing about the extent of the final solution, although clearly his vocabulary and thoughts have been, like in Mein Kampf and other things, have been, viewed by people and can obviously seem abhorrent, and were. But I feel like he couldn't have been thought of the same, like, maniacal, madman, maniac, evil person that he is today back then, when the reason he's sort of thought of as that is the atrocities he committed. Well, those aren't found out until really the ending of the war, right? So maybe Hitler might have seemed more sane and like your average kind of world leader, dictator, strongman, rather than what we know him as today.
Earlier scenarios was...
Hitler was.
I think if we're talking about peace, obviously one of our earlier scenarios was occupation. That's a lot more brutal than a peace ordinarily would be.
Yeah.
One of the interesting questions is actually, in a peace, what happens to a figure like Churchill? Because in a brutal occupation, he's either imprisoned or executed, or he dies choking on his own blood. But in a peace, I mean, it's very possible that he certainly resigns, but whether he goes into a kind of retirement, or he in fact flees to America and becomes a kind of British de Gaulle. I can see Hitler as well, after bringing Britain to the negotiating table, staying in Britain, making Britain actually the political and economic centre, and Hitler himself, he was eyeing up Blenheim Palace as his official residence. And you can almost imagine him putting Churchill, if Churchill hasn't fled by then, him putting him sort of in a butler's uniform or something and having him strut around serving Hitler and his cronies.
He would have been a bloody terrible butler.
Exactly.
So the uncertainty I have is, am I putting too much weight on this? My uncertainty is what is the reaction of America? Because if America is already in this, in the war with Germany, right? They're on Britain's side. They're supplying them. They're sending, and they're not as if they're preparing for D-Day or anything, but they're in the war. And then Britain is overtaken. Then it's easy to see that, well, it would clearly continue from the Americans would be in the war against Hitler, and it would continue there. And I'm sure Churchill would become a sort of de Gaulle, but in America. And I'm sure de Gaulle would go to America as well. But since they're not at war, Germany and America yet, and America is not fully on Britain's side 100% in this war, that's a lot of uncertainty of your chances of or likelihood of any sort of chance at resistance, which I think would change how a lot of people act,
Bringing him and Hitler and his cronies' drinks. I mean, in terms of a real peace settlement, I think it's likely that actually one of the more pro-peace politicians would likely have been the one negotiating with Hitler on those terms.
So if Churchill was captured or, sort of imprisoned in occupation, the Germans would have had a real dilemma on their hands. They would have either had, kill him horribly and make an example of him, but then also would that have made him a martyr for the resistance?
I feel like they would just shoot him. I think that's probably what would happen. Like, I don't see Churchill as someone who is going to turn around and be a puppet, I think he's just gonna like spit in your face and say kill me or something like that. And you don't want to make him a martyr or anger people so much with some horrible death, but maybe just a quick side like, oh yeah, he's dead now, might have been the best course of action for Germany.
So you kind of have the issue of what could they have actually feasibly done with Churchill, whereas in a peace deal that actually might have been more preferable to the Germans, because then, you know, it's either that they can try and oust him or replace him with someone else, and then he's not their
Or they would probably just imprison him, I would say, rather than just kill him.
And, you know, it's either that they can try and oust him or...
It's one of the two, though. There's no way he's going to be turned into some sort of ally to Germany and getting the British public on their side. That doesn't seem Churchill. Even despite what I said before about wanting to put the message forward of stalwart defense of the country, yeah, I don't think, I think Churchill in terms of being any help to the Germany in any political image sense is just not going to happen. So it's either a kind of quick out of the way death or just imprisonment.
Or replace him with someone else, and then he's not their problem in the same way.
And I think also for the British people, a very, very different idea and a very, very different perception of British national character, which obviously is formed by beating back, Fritz and the Jerrys and all this type of thing.
Yeah.
I wonder what Hitler would have asked for in the negotiations about the status of the German physicist living in London, like Leo Szilard, who was working on the nuclear bomb at the time.
It's very possible that actually...
Oh my God, you got to get all of those scientists to Canada right away. Oh my God, you have to do that. Any and all of your scientists need to go to America or Canada. If you don't, I understand if you don't want to give it, at least go to Canada. All right, don't let them fall into their hands like we got von Braun into our space program.
Peace scenario. The Germans would have had a good chance of developing the atomic bomb before the Americans, and obviously way before the Russians anyway. Might that have forced the hand of the Americans to come in? How long-lived would peace have been? Probably not so.
Oh my God, if the atomic bomb is made, it's game over. I'm sorry, it's game over. Especially if you're able to create 2, 3, or 4 of them. Yeah, I know America has the ability, because it's so isolated, so far away from all of the conflict, and has very secure and safe from bombing raids because of the distance of manufacturing, and have a lot of raw materials and the society to create weapons and giant projects like the Manhattan Project without too many hiccups or interruptions. And maybe the Germans don't have that, but the Germans haven't started Barbarossa yet, right? Would they still do it, or was Barbarossa more done as quickly as it was because, all right, Britain's not following anytime soon, we gotta at least take out Russia?
Well, and you mentioned the Soviets. We should point out that Hitler would have had his objective, turning to war in the East with no undefeated enemies on his western flank. Do you think the war would have gone differently in the East?
If either a peace deal had been made or indeed there'd been an occupation of Britain, we wouldn't have had a blitz, and if we'd not had a blitz, then the Luftwaffe wouldn't have had to divert its resources away from its unsuccessful campaign in the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. It would have automatically had those resources at its hand and could have launched Operation Barbarossa even earlier in 1941, and of course avoided the infamous winter. So we never know. So
true. No British army in Greece in 1941, diverting German attention so they can start Barbarossa earlier, get to Moscow in time. I love what if history. Luke Pepper, thank you for outlining your case for Britain.
I would imagine that America would be, if Britain fell, that America might not even need a Pearl Harbor to throw their weight behind anyone. I'm sure America, because at that point, that much successful conquering by any party in Britain or others around the world that is going to change the world so dramatically is going to have enormous effects on the United States, right? So you might not even need, it's not this European war that's going to change the borders a little bit, and America might not be that hurt in the long run if they stay out. This is different. This is world order changing level of stuff, right? So either America just goes full on. So at that point, I think staying neutral isn't an option. You're either going to start peace talks and some sort of cooperation with the Germans as the Americans, or you're going to collaborate with the rest of the British government that was able to flee, and you're going to collaborate with Russia. You're going to have to land in the Middle East or something like that. The U-boats won't have to worry so much about trade from... The U-boats will be able to be used elsewhere. It's then, I think, a matter of where in the world you find... I would guess Iran would be a big turning point, or a big focus point for the Allies if America gets in, right? Because that's a place where, you know, you can get to Russia. That's in our timeline what happened, right? They sort of went through Iran to be able to supply Russia, and obviously in the North Pacific, you know, to far eastern Russia. But as soon as Russia is seen, it's got to be just full-blown supply Russia in any way possible, and undermine the China and the Japanese. So helping the Chinese, helping the Russians, that would probably be the next step for the Americans if they went into the war, which I believe they would, because of the enormous changes to the world that's going to happen that will affect them. It's just, where do they go? Do they, all right, we need to fight Germany, and so start finding our allies? If Pearl Harbor happens, seeing the relationship Germany and Japan had, I'm assuming even more easily than in our timeline, Germany would back behind Japan. But if American and German talks happened in between the fall of Britain and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, maybe something else would have happened. Maybe Japan might not attack Pearl Harbor. Maybe Germany might see losing its alliance with Japan as more of a sacrificial thing in order to keep any slightly good relations with the U.S. if they are built in the meantime. But yeah, Iran, Middle East, North Africa, supplying Russia, supplying China, fighting the Japanese would be the next go-to for America if they stayed on the Ally side.
Britain's
I think,
peace
in my
with Germany. We'll never know what would have happened if the RAF had been defeated in the autumn of 1940. Perhaps the Home Guard would have seen off an invasion on the south coast. Perhaps German troops would have marched down the Mall. Would Churchill have been overthrown in order to secure a peace deal? They all seem incredibly unlikely given what happened. But it's worth remembering that if we go back to 1930, nothing of what followed would have seemed inevitable at that time. Britain's declaration of war against Germany, the rise of Winston Churchill to the position of Prime Minister, the success of the Royal Air Force against Germany. All of these events looked fairly unlikely at one point or another. And if history had diverged, as it could easily have done, things would have turned out very different indeed.
Now, that was awesome. Okay. Amazing video. They did cover, I thought they would cover more the grand picture of World War II and what would happen. But seeing as they're all British and, you know, we're talking about Britain, just what would happen in Britain, that makes more sense now. And it was equally enjoyable, in my opinion, right? I really enjoyed that. I talked a lot for sure. I gave a lot of opinions, I guess. Would appreciate any comments down below, guys. Would love to see what you have to say. Love y'all. And hopefully I'll see you next video. Bye, guys.